An 8-year-old girl's simple question left a town speechless and moved Trump to share a deeply personal story. It was a quiet evening in a church fellowship hall in Shreveport, Louisiana. The usual sounds of folding chairs scraping on the floor and soft conversations filled the air. This room, usually used for Sunday potlucks and Bible studies, had a different feeling tonight. At the front of the room stood Donald Trump. His famous presence filled the space. His familiar orange complexion and hand gestures were easy to spot. But tonight, he seemed different, quieter, maybe even aware of how important the moment was. The crowd was a mix of families, retirees, and curious locals, all eager to hear what he had to say. But in the middle of them all, there was one person who stood out, not because of her size, but because of the intensity in her gaze. Little 8-year-old Lily, wearing her best Sunday dress, stood at the front of the room. She tightly held an old, leather-bound Bible against her chest, her innocent face showing a mix of curiosity and seriousness. The old Bible Lily held was a precious gift passed down from her grandmother. Its pages were worn, and the gold letters had faded over time. Before they arrived, her mother had whispered softly to her, "You can ask him, but only if you're brave enough and if you truly mean it." Lily had nodded, her heart racing. For weeks, she had been preparing her question, writing it down in her notebook during recess and whispering it to herself at night before bed. It wasn't just a question out of curiosity, but one that weighed deeply on her heart. As the evening went on, Donald Trump spoke about his usual topics, his policies, achievements, and his vision for America. The crowd clapped politely or nodded, but the energy was far quieter than his typical rallies. Lily sat quietly, gripping her Bible tighter with every passing minute. Then, the moment finally came. Trump opened the floor for questions. A line quickly formed with adults stepping up, eager to ask about local issues, national policies, and even to compliment him on his famous red tie. Lily hesitated. Her small body seemed to shrink into her seat. But when her mother gave her a gentle nudge, Lily knew it was her time. With shaky legs, she stood up. Her heart pounded so loudly, she was sure everyone could hear it. The line of people seemed endless, but as Lily moved forward, the room grew quieter. People started to notice her. The little girl, holding the oversized Bible tightly against her chest, made the room go quiet. Whispers spread through the crowd as her turn approached. When she finally stepped forward, Donald Trump looked down at her. His usual stern expression softened for a moment. "What's your question, young lady?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly gentle. Lily swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the Bible until her knuckles turned white. Then, with a voice that shook but didn't falter, she asked the question that had been in her heart for months. "Mr. Trump, what does God mean to you?" The room went completely still. Everyone's eyes shifted between Lily and Trump, and the weight of her question hung in the air, heavy and real. For a man known for quick answers and sharp comebacks, Trump didn't respond right away. He just looked at Lily, then at the Bible she was holding. Something seemed to change in him, and the room felt tense with anticipation. Everyone leaned forward, waiting. Trump's silence was almost deafening. This wasn't the confident, fast-talking man people were used to. This moment felt different. He stared at Lily for a long time, his usual bravado replaced by something softer, more thoughtful. For a brief moment, Trump appeared almost vulnerable. His gaze fell again on the Bible that Lily was holding, and his lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Lily shifted slightly, her small frame looking even more fragile under the weight of the room's attention. Her question wasn't meant to challenge or provoke anyone. It was honest, born from a deep desire to understand something much bigger than herself. And somehow, her sincerity seemed louder than any political debate or shouted slogan. The room stayed completely quiet. Even the slightest sounds, the creaking of chairs, a muffled cough, seemed to vanish, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Trump finally raised his hand, as if trying to steady himself, and leaned against the podium. "That's a big question," he said, his voice softer and steadier than usual. "And it's not one I've always had the answer to." His words caught many off guard. Trump, known for his strong confidence, was admitting uncertainty in front of a crowd. He looked at Lily, and his expression shifted again, this time to something almost fatherly. "When I was about your age," he continued, "I had a lot of questions about God too. My parents took me to church every Sunday. I remember sitting in those pews, staring at the stained glass windows, and wondering if God was even listening to me." He paused, glancing out at the audience, almost as if checking how they were reacting. His hand rested on the podium, fingers tapping lightly against the wood. "My father used to tell me," Trump began, "that faith is like a ladder. You climb it one step at a time, and sometimes you're scared you'll fall. But you keep climbing because there's something up there worth reaching for." At the time, I didn't really understand what he meant. I thought it was just something he said to keep me quiet. A soft chuckle rippled through the crowd, easing the tension just a little, but Lily didn't smile. Her eyes stayed locked on him, waiting for the real answer to her question. Trump leaned forward, his voice softening even more. "But as I got older, life threw a lot of challenges my way. I faced losses, failures, and moments when I wasn't sure I could keep going. In those times, I didn't always feel like God was with me. Sometimes, I was angry at him. Other times, I wondered if he had just given up on me altogether." The room stayed silent. This wasn't the polished speech people were used to hearing. This was something real, something raw. Trump took a deep breath and continued, his voice growing stronger. "But I'll tell you this." He paused, looking out at the crowd. "Even in my worst moments. When I thought I was alone," Trump continued, "I realized that faith isn't about always having the answers. It's about believing that even when you can't see the whole picture, there's a purpose. There's something greater at work." He glanced back at Lily. Her grip on the Bible had loosened slightly, and her wide eyes shimmered in the soft glow of the fluorescent lights. "And God, to me," he said slowly, "is that purpose. He's the reminder that even when we fall, even when we fail, we're not done. He's the one who keeps telling us to climb the ladder, even when it feels like it's going to break." Before the weight of his words could fully sink in, Lily's eyes filled with tears. The crowd began to murmur softly, sensing that something extraordinary was happening. Lily's tears came quietly at first, a single drop slipping down her cheek as she held her grandmother's Bible tightly against her chest. But as Trump's words hung in the air, her small shoulders began to tremble. The room noticed, their whispers growing louder, but no one dared interrupt the moment. Her mother leaned over, instinctively placing a comforting hand on her back. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered gently. But Lily shook her head. This wasn't sadness. It was something deeper. Trump's words had touched her in a way nothing else ever had. Lily hadn't known she needed to hear those words, but when Trump spoke, he touched a part of her heart she had kept hidden. It was a feeling she hadn't expected, and it seemed to open something deep within her. Trump noticed her reaction. He took a step back from the podium, his usual confident expression replaced by something gentler. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Lily," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's a beautiful name," he said, offering a small smile. "You know, Lily, sometimes the simplest questions are the hardest ones to answer, and sometimes those questions remind us of what really matters." Lily nodded, her tear-filled eyes never leaving him. "My grandma used to say that too," she said quietly. "She said God is always listening, even when you don't hear him." Trump's expression changed slightly. Something unspoken passed between them, a mix of admiration and understanding. He took a deep breath, then turned his attention back to the crowd. "You know," he said, his voice growing more serious, "this little girl just asked a question that most adults are too afraid to ask. What does God mean to us?" The room was completely still now, everyone hanging on his words. "It's not an easy question," Trump continued. "It makes us look inward, face our fears, our doubts, and our flaws." The weight of his words settled over the crowd, and, for a brief moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. It felt as though Lily wasn't just a little girl holding a Bible. She had become a symbol of something much bigger. Her courage had changed the entire mood of the evening, turning it from a typical town hall into something much more personal, an honest reflection on faith and humanity. Trump spoke again, his voice steady, but softer than before. "We live in a world where we're always looking for answers outside of ourselves. We think power, success, or money will fill the empty spaces, but they don't. The real answers are the ones that make us uncomfortable. The ones that make us ask, what do I stand for? What do I believe in? And who am I when no one else is looking?" He paused, his gaze returning to Lily. "Thank you for reminding me of that, Lily," he said, his tone sincere. "You're wiser than most adults I know." The crowd responded with soft applause, but Lily didn't seem to notice. Her tears had stopped, replaced by a quiet look of pride. She wiped her cheeks with the sleeve of her dress and looked up at her mother, who smiled back with teary eyes of her own. But as the applause faded, Trump's tone changed once again. It was clear that this conversation wasn't over yet. The room grew even quieter, as if the air itself was waiting for Trump's next words. He shifted at the podium, his eyes scanning the crowd before settling on Lily once again. There was a weight in his expression, something deeper than politics or public life. "When I was a young man," Trump began, his voice softer now, "there was a time when I thought I had it all figured out. I had ambition, plans, and the drive to succeed. But there was one moment in my life, a single moment, that made me realize how little control I actually had." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. The crowd leaned forward, eager to hear more. Trump rarely shared personal stories, and now it seemed like he was about to open up. "My brother Fred," he continued. "He was one of the kindest, most genuine people I've ever known. He had this light about him, this goodness that I couldn't fully understand at the time. But Fred struggled. He had his demons, and no matter how much my family and I tried to help him, it wasn't enough." Trump's voice faltered for a moment, and he cleared his throat. "When he passed away, I was angry. Angry at him, angry at myself, and angry at God. I couldn't understand why someone so good, someone with so much potential, had to leave this world so soon." Lily's eyes stayed locked on him, her young face filled with a wisdom beyond her years. Around the room, others watched, equally captivated. Their faces were a mix of empathy and curiosity. Trump paused for a long moment, then continued, his voice growing quieter. "I turned away from God. I thought, if he's real, why would he let something like that happen? Why would he take someone like Fred and leave me behind?" He exhaled deeply, his hand gripping the podium. "But then something changed," he said, his tone softer. "I don't know if it was a dream or just a memory, but one night I saw Fred's face in my mind. He was smiling, this big goofy smile he used to have. And I heard him say, 'Don't be angry, Don. You've got work to do.'" The room was completely silent now. The weight of his words seemed to fill the space, pressing down on everyone. Even the faint sound of cars passing outside seemed to disappear, leaving only Trump's voice and the shared beat of their hearts. "I realized then," Trump said, his voice steadying, "that faith isn't about understanding everything. It's about trusting that there's a reason, even when you can't see it. And maybe, just maybe, Fred's purpose was to teach me that. He turned back to Lily, his expression softening. So, when you ask me what God means to me, I'll say this. He's the reason I keep going, even when it's hard. He's the reminder that we're here for more than just ourselves, and He's the one who gives us hope, even in the darkest times. Lily's eyes shimmered again, but this time her tears didn't fall. Instead, she stood a little taller, clutching her grandmother's Bible with both hands, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Just as the room seemed to settle, drawn into the weight of Trump's words, someone in the back of the hall raised their hand. The silence was broken, and attention shifted quickly in a new direction. A man at the back stood slowly, his hand still raised. His rugged face, lined with years of hard work, wore a serious expression. He was the kind of person you might pass on the street without a second thought. A mechanic, a father, maybe someone who only went to church when life allowed. But when he spoke, his voice cut through the silence like a bell. "Mr. Trump," he said, his words measured and deliberate, "I've spent years trying to figure out my own faith. Hearing you talk about it like this, about anger, doubt, and hope, it makes me wonder if maybe all of us have been too afraid to admit we're struggling. Do you think that's part of the problem?" The question seemed to catch Trump off guard, but he didn't hesitate long. He leaned slightly on the podium, his gaze meeting the man's. "You know," Trump began, "I think a lot of us are afraid to admit we're not as strong as we want people to think we are. Faith isn't easy. It's messy. It's complicated. And sometimes it feels like you're just shouting into the void. But the truth is, that's what makes it so powerful. It's not about being perfect. It's about trying, even when you don't have all the answers." The man nodded, his expression softening as he sat back down. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, but it was Lily's voice that broke the quiet next. "My grandma used to say faith is like planting seeds," Lily said, her words clear and steady, despite her small frame. "You don't always see them grow right away, but you have to believe." "They will," Trump smiled, a genuine, almost tender expression crossing his face, softening his usually guarded demeanor. "Your grandma sounds like a very wise woman," he said. "And she's right. Faith is like a seed. It doesn't always sprout the way you expect, but that doesn't mean it's not there, growing in ways you can't see." The room seemed to come alive with a new energy. People began nodding, sharing glances, and whispering quietly to those sitting next to them. What had started as a structured town hall had turned into something much more personal, a shared reflection on life's challenges, doubts, and moments of grace. An older woman, her silver hair neatly pulled back into a bun, raised her hand. "I lost my husband last year," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been angry at God ever since. I feel like I've lost my faith completely. Do you think it's too late to find it again?" Trump stepped closer to the edge of the stage, his voice soft but steady. "It's never too late," he said. "Faith isn't something you lose forever. It's something that waits for you," Trump continued, his voice steady. "And sometimes, it's in the quietest moments, when you least expect it, that it comes back to you." The woman nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. Around the room, others seemed equally moved, some dabbing at their faces with tissues, others sitting in quiet reflection. As Trump's words settled into the hearts of everyone present, it became clear that the evening had shifted. It wasn't just about questions and answers anymore. It was about connection, and what came next would only deepen that bond. The room felt electric, not with noise, but with an energy that was tangible, an energy of shared vulnerability. People who had come expecting a typical political talk were now part of something deeply personal. It was as if Lily's simple question had opened a door no one had dared to approach before, and now no one wanted to turn back. Trump straightened up, his gaze sweeping across the room. "You know," he said, his voice quieter now, "there's something I've learned over the years. Faith doesn't always show up in grand moments. It's in the small ones. The times when someone lends a hand, listens when you're hurting, or asks a question as brave as Lily's. Those moments remind us of what really matters. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Trump, who was so often commanding and confident, now spoke with a humility that struck a chord deep within the room. He gestured toward Lily, his expression softening. "This little girl reminded me tonight," Trump said, his voice steady, "that faith isn't just something we talk about, it's something we live. And when we live it, it spreads." Lily smiled faintly, her cheeks still flushed from earlier. Her mother pulled her close, whispering something in her ear that made her smile a little wider. Trump's tone grew firmer. "We're living in a time when it feels like the world is pulling us apart. Politics, opinions, differences. But faith has the power to bring us together. It's not about being the same. It's about understanding that we're all climbing that same ladder, one step at a time, no matter how different our paths might look." A ripple of applause began. Slow at first, but soon building in strength. People stood, clapping, not just for Trump, but for the moment itself. For the courage it took Lily to ask her question, and for the answers it had drawn out of everyone in the room. As the applause began to fade, Trump leaned in one last time. "So tonight," he said, his voice quieter now, "I'll leave you with this. Ask yourselves what faith means to you. And don't be afraid of the answer, no matter how uncertain it might be. Because faith isn't about knowing. It's about believing." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Then, with one last thought, he added, "And if you found something tonight that touched you, hold on to it. Let it grow," Trump said, "and share it with the people who need it most." The room erupted in applause once again, but this time it was more than just clapping. There were hugs, handshakes, and even a few tears. Strangers who had entered the hall with little more than polite nods now lingered, exchanging smiles and stories. It felt like a collective weight had been lifted, replaced by a quiet, shared hope. Lily, now standing with her mother, watched as Trump stepped away from the podium. He walked over to her, kneeling slightly to meet her at eye level. "Thank you, Lily," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "You've got more courage than most people twice your age. Don't ever lose that." Lily nodded, extending her small hand to shake his. "Thank you, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice steady now, "for answering." Trump gave her a faint smile before turning to wave at the crowd as he exited. The room buzzed with conversation, the people clearly moved by what had just unfolded. Lily looked up at her mother, her voice soft but determined. "Grandma would have been proud, wouldn't she?" Her mother smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. "She would have been more than proud, sweetheart. She would have been amazed." As the hall slowly emptied, the message was clear. Sometimes, the bravest questions lead to the most unexpected answers. And in those answers, we find pieces of ourselves we didn't even know were missing. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on your own faith and share it with someone who might need it today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and bring us closer together.